Frank's hands shook as he stared at the signature. The foreclosure notice crumpled between his fingers like dead leaves, but his eyes stayed fixed on those two words that had just blown his world apart. Marion Morrison. The desert wind rattled the windows of his office trailer, parked between the skeletal remains of a saloon set and a fake jail that hadn't seen cameras in 5 years. Through the smudged glass, he watched tumbleweeds dance between the rotting facades like ghosts celebrating his downfall. 30 years. 30 goddamn years since he'd thrown that gangly kid out of his office at Republic Pictures. The boy had stood there in his cheap boots and borrowed cowboy hat, stammering about wanting to be in westerns. Frank could still hear his own laughter echoing off the mahogany walls of his corner office, could still see the humiliation spreading across the kid's face like spilled ink. "You want to be a cowboy?" Frank had sneered that day. "Go back to Iowa and milk cows. You've got about as much authenticity as a wooden nickel." He'd done more than reject him. He'd made phone calls, spread the word, made sure Marion Morrison would never work in Hollywood as long as Frank Morrison had breath in his lungs and connections in his Rolodex. And now that same kid owned everything. Frank stumbled out of the trailer into the scorching afternoon heat. The Bakersfield sun beat down mercilessly on the ghost town he'd built from the wreckage of his Hollywood career. When the big studios had pushed him out in '47, too old, too mean, too stuck in the past, he'd poured his savings into this place. 40 acres of California desert transformed into a rental facility for B-picture westerns and television shows. For a while, it had worked. The movie ranch had been busy enough to keep him in bourbon and bitterness. But television was killing the B-western market, and the big productions went to the fancier spreads in Newhall and Simi Valley. Frank's sets had started looking shabby by comparison, his equipment outdated. The irony wasn't lost on him. While his ranch rotted in the desert, Marion Morrison, now calling himself John Wayne, had become the biggest cowboy star in the world. The Quiet Man, Red River, The Searchers. Every picture a hit, every role cementing his reputation as America's cowboy. Frank kicked at a loose board on the saloon's front steps. The whole facade shuddered, ready to collapse, like everything else in his life. He pulled out the flask from his jacket pocket and took a long pull of whiskey. The burn felt good going down, familiar. He'd been drinking more lately, especially after the phone calls from creditors had started coming daily. The ranch was hemorrhaging money, and at 58, Frank was too proud to beg and too old to start over. That's when Alamo Holdings had appeared like a mirage in the desert. Cash buyers, no questions asked, offering twice what the place was worth. Frank should have known it was too good to be true, should have dug deeper into the corporate paperwork. Instead, he'd been blinded by desperation and greed. Now he understood. This wasn't a business transaction. It was revenge served colder than a dead man's grave. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached down the dirt road that led to his ranch. Frank squinted against the sun and made out the shape of a black Cadillac cutting through the heat shimmer. His stomach clenched. The car pulled up in front of the main set, engine ticking as it cooled. The driver's door opened, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. John Wayne stepped out. He was bigger than Frank remembered, filled out from the scrawny kid who'd shuffled into his office 3 decades ago. The shoulders were broader, the jaw more defined, the eyes harder. He wore dark jeans, a white shirt, and a brown leather jacket that probably cost more than Frank made in 6 months. But it was still him. Still Marion Morrison under all that Hollywood polish. Wayne didn't speak immediately. He stood beside the Cadillac, hands on his hips, surveying the property like a general reviewing conquered territory. His gaze swept across the false front buildings, the water tower with peeling paint, the corral where prop horses used to graze. Finally, his eyes settled on Frank. "Afternoon, Mr. Morrison." Wayne's voice carried that familiar drawl that had made him millions. "Beautiful day to be moving out, don't you think?" Frank's hand instinctively moved toward the trailer where he kept his .38 revolver. The gesture wasn't lost on Wayne, who smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "I wouldn't recommend that," Wayne said quietly. "We're just 2 old men having a conversation about real estate. Nothing more." The desert wind picked up, sending a tumbleweed rolling between them like a witness to their standoff. In that moment, Frank realized this was just the beginning. Wayne hadn't bought his ranch to run a business. He'd bought it to destroy the man who'd tried to destroy him. The reckoning had only just begun. Frank's mouth had gone dry as parchment. The whiskey on his breath felt suddenly shameful under Wayne's steady gaze, and he fought the urge to wipe his lips with the back of his hand. 30 years collapsed into this single moment, and he was no longer the powerful studio executive who'd once decided the fates of hopeful actors with the casual cruelty of a Roman emperor. He was just a broken-down old man standing in the ruins of his own ambitions. "I suppose you're here to gloat," Frank managed, his voice cracking like the dried wood of his dying sets. The words came out smaller than he'd intended, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert around them. Wayne's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of the boy he'd once been, vulnerable and desperate for approval. Gloat? He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing gray at his temples that Frank hadn't noticed before. "That would suggest this gives me pleasure, Mr. Morrison, and I can assure you there's no joy in any of this." The afternoon sun cast long shadows between them, turning the western town into a tableau of Judgment Day. Frank found himself studying Wayne's face, searching for traces of the stammering kid who'd stood in his office clutching a headshot with bent corners. The transformation was complete. Hollywood had sculpted Marion Morrison into something larger than life, a myth made flesh. But Frank knew the truth about myths. He'd helped create enough of them in his day, polishing rough farm boys into leading men, teaching chorus girls to be queens. The magic was always in the machinery, never the person. Except Wayne had done it without the machinery, without Frank's help, despite Frank's interference. "You know," Wayne said, walking toward the nearest building, a fake general store with a canvas backdrop painted to look like shelved goods. "I used to drive out here sometimes, when I was between pictures, just to watch you work." Frank's chest tightened. "That's a lie." "No lie." Wayne ran his hand along the store's wooden railing, testing its stability. The whole structure creaked ominously. "I'd park up on that ridge, use binoculars, watched you directing those little crews, barking orders like you were Cecil B. DeMille making the 10 Commandments instead of some 2-bit cowboy picture that'd play the bottom half of a double bill." The words hit Frank like physical blows. He thought of all those productions, the cheap westerns that had kept his lights on, the television episodes that barely covered his overhead. Had Wayne really been watching? Seeing Frank's slow decline from studio mogul to proprietor of a third-rate facility that rented horses and stagecoaches to productions too poor for the real lots? Why? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Wayne stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Because I wanted to understand what made you so goddamn cruel. Thought maybe if I watched you long enough, I'd figure out what kind of man destroys dreams for sport." Frank felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, which had calcified years ago, but something deeper. Some last vestige of the man he'd been before Hollywood had taught him that power meant stepping on faces. He thought about the flask in his pocket, the comfort it would bring, but his hand stayed at his side. "I was protecting the industry," Frank said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "You had no experience, no training." "I had passion." Wayne's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "I had hunger. I had everything those pretty boys from New York and Chicago didn't have. I understood what the West really was. But you couldn't see past your own prejudices." Frank opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. What defense could he offer? That he'd been drunk on power? That saying yes to unknown actors was harder than saying no? That by 1926 he'd already crushed so many dreams that one more hardly seemed to matter? The truth was uglier than any excuse. Frank had enjoyed it. The fear in their eyes when he leaned back in his leather chair and delivered his verdict. The way their faces crumpled when he explained with clinical precision why they'd never make it in pictures. The absolute power of being the man who decided who got to live their dreams and who went home to ordinary lives. "Dolores always said I was too hard on people," Frank heard himself saying. The name slipped out before he could stop it. His ex-wife, gone these 15 years. The only person who'd ever called him on his cruelty and made it stick. Wayne's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She left you." "She died." Frank's throat constricted. Cancer. But she'd already left, years before. said she couldn't watch me turn into someone she didn't recognize. The wind picked up again, rattling the loose boards and sending dust devils spinning between the buildings like restless spirits. In the distance, a hawk circled something dead in the scrub brush, patient and eternal. Frank realized with crystalline clarity that this was the end of everything. Not just the ranch, but the last connection to the man he'd once been, before Hollywood had taught him that other people's pain could be currency. Wayne's face remained impassive for a long moment, then he reached into his jacket pocket. Frank tensed, but Wayne only withdrew a manila envelope, weathered and yellowed with age. He held it between them like evidence at a trial. "You know what this is?" Wayne's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the desert silence. Frank stared at the envelope, dread pooling in his stomach like acid. Something about its careful preservation, the way Wayne held it with deliberate reverence, made his hands begin to shake again. "I've carried this for 30 years, Wayne continued, his thumb tracing the edge of the envelope. "Took it with me to every audition, every screen test, every meeting. A reminder of what you did to me in that office." "What I did?" Frank's voice cracked. "I gave you an honest assessment. Open it." The envelope landed in the dust between them with a soft thud. Frank stared down at it, his name written across the front in faded blue ink. Below it, a date that made his blood run cold, November 15th, 1926, the day after Wayne's audition. "I don't know what game you're playing," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. The date meant something. He could feel the memory scratching at the edges of his consciousness like a caged animal. "Open it," Wayne repeated, his tone carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded respect from directors and producers for 3 decades. "Or I'll read it for you." Frank's knees felt unsteady. He lowered himself to a crouch and picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt fragile, ready to disintegrate at his touch. His name was written in his own handwriting, younger, more confident strokes from a man who'd believed his power was eternal. Inside was a single sheet of Republic Pictures letterhead, folded neatly. Frank unfolded it and felt the desert floor tilt beneath him. It was a letter he'd dictated to his secretary, Helen, the day after Wayne's disastrous audition. A letter he'd forgotten in the decades since, buried under thousands of other cruelties and humiliations he'd inflicted. "Read it," Wayne said, out loud. Frank's mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before the words came. "To whom it may concern, this letter serves as notice that Marion Morrison has been deemed unsuitable for employment by Republic Pictures or any of its affiliated studios. Mr. Morrison lacks the physical presence, vocal quality, and authentic Western bearing required for motion picture work. Furthermore, his persistence after rejection demonstrates poor judgment and unprofessional behavior. We strongly advise against casting Mr. Morrison in any capacity. Signed, Frank Morrison, Director of Talent Acquisition." The paper fluttered in Frank's hands like a dying bird. He remembered now, not just writing the letter, but the satisfaction he'd felt sealing it. He'd sent copies to every studio in Hollywood, every casting director he knew, a blacklist disguised as professional courtesy. "You mailed copies to 18 studios, Wayne said, his voice hollow. "Took me 15 years to find out why I couldn't get arrested in this town. Finally tracked down a secretary at MGM who remembered seeing it." Frank felt bile rising in his throat. "You were just one of hundreds." "I was 19 years old." Wayne's composure finally cracked, revealing the fury that had been simmering beneath the surface. "I had nothing. No connections, no money, no family in the business. That letter was a death sentence, and you knew it." The weight of 30 years crashed down on Frank like a collapsing set. How many nights had Wayne gone to bed hungry because of that letter? How many odd jobs had he worked? How many dreams had he buried before finally clawing his way back into an industry that had branded him unemployable? "The miracle isn't that I became John Wayne," Wayne continued, his voice steady again but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut bone. "The miracle is that I survived Frank Morrison." Frank tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The letter fell from his numb fingers, caught by the desert wind and carried away like a ghost finally released from its haunting. "Why show me this now?" Frank whispered. Wayne's smile returned, but it was different this time. Not cold anymore, but infinitely sad. Because I wanted you to remember. Before I take everything away from you, I wanted you to remember what you took from me. What you took from all of them. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as the full scope of Wayne's revenge began to crystallize. This wasn't just about the ranch. It was about every actor Frank had blacklisted, every dream he'd crushed, every career he'd ended with casual cruelty. The desert wind howled around them, carrying away the last of Frank's illusions about who he was and what he'd done. There would be no going back to the comfortable delusion that his actions had been justified, that his cruelty had served some greater purpose. The letter was gone, but the truth it contained had taken root in the poisoned soil of his memory, and Frank knew it would grow there until it consumed everything he had left. Frank remained crouched in the dust long after the letter disappeared into the desert wind, his body refusing to obey his commands to stand. The weight of Wayne's revelation pressed down on him like the heat radiating from the cracked earth beneath his knees. When he finally managed to rise, Wayne was already walking back toward his Cadillac with the unhurried gait of a man who had all the time in the world. "This conversation isn't over," Frank called out, his voice barely carrying across the space between them. But Wayne didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the words. He simply climbed into his car and drove away, leaving Frank alone with the echoing silence and the taste of his own desperation. Frank stumbled back to his trailer, his hands shaking so violently he needed 3 attempts to turn the door handle. Inside, the familiar smell of stale cigarettes and spilled bourbon provided no comfort. He went straight to the phone and dialed with urgent, clumsy fingers. "Mickey, it's Frank Morrison. I need you to look into something for me." Mickey Torino had been Frank's fixer back in the studio days, a private investigator who specialized in the kind of delicate matters that studios preferred to handle quietly. If anyone could find holes in Wayne's corporate structure, weak points that might give Frank leverage, it would be Mickey. "Jesus, Frank, I haven't heard from you in what, 5 years?" Mickey's gravelly voice carried the weight of too many cigarettes and too many secrets. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet. Listen, I need you to dig into a company called Alamo Holdings. Shell Corporation, probably got layers. Find out who's really behind it, how deep their pockets are, what their vulnerabilities might be." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Frank wondered if the connection had died. When Mickey finally spoke, his voice had changed, become careful, distant. "Frank, maybe you should just let sleeping dogs lie on this one." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means some people have long memories and longer reach. You burned a lot of bridges in this town, and not all of them stayed burned." The line went dead. Frank stared at the receiver, feeling ice water replace the blood in his veins. Mickey had handled studio scandals, buried stories that could have destroyed careers, made problems disappear with the efficiency of a mortician. If Mickey was scared, Frank tried 3 more calls. His old secretary Helen, now working for Columbia, claimed she was too busy to talk and hung up before he could explain what he needed. Tom Brewster, who'd run publicity for Republic in the 40s, let the phone ring until Frank gave up. Jimmy Kowalski, a junior executive who'd owed Frank favors, answered but turned cold the moment Frank mentioned needing information about recent corporate acquisitions. "Sorry, Frank, but I can't help you with that," Jimmy said, and Frank could hear something in his voice, not just reluctance but fear. Some stones are better left unturned, you know. By evening, Frank had worked his way through every contact in his address book who might have access to corporate records or industry intelligence. The responses followed a pattern that made his skin crawl: initial surprise at hearing from him, then immediate withdrawal once he explained what he needed. It was as if Wayne's name carried some invisible warning, a signal that Frank Morrison was now radioactive. He sat in his trailer as darkness fell over the ranch, nursing a tumbler of bourbon and staring at the phone as if it might ring with salvation. The generator hummed outside, providing the only electrical power to his small corner of the vast property. Beyond its reach, the western sets disappeared into shadow, becoming silhouettes of dreams that had never quite materialized. The sound of approaching vehicles made him look up from his drink. 3 sets of headlights cut through the darkness, moving slowly down the dirt road toward his trailer. Frank's stomach clenched as he recognized the purposeful way they traveled. Not casual visitors, but men with business to conduct. The vehicle stopped just outside the pool of light from his generator. Frank heard car doors slamming, footsteps on gravel, low voices conferring. He reached for the .38 in his desk drawer, then stopped. If Wayne had sent men to kill him, they wouldn't have announced themselves with headlights. A knock came at his trailer door. 3 measured raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and ominous. "Mr. Morrison." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "We need to speak with you about your situation here." Frank's hand hovered over the gun. Everything about this felt wrong. The timing, the formal tone, the way his old contacts had suddenly developed amnesia. Wayne wasn't just destroying his present, he was systematically erasing Frank's past, cutting off every avenue of escape or resistance. The knock came again, more insistent. "We're not going away, Mr. Morrison. You can make this easy or difficult, but either way, we're having this conversation tonight." Frank closed his eyes and tasted the bitter truth. He was completely alone, with nowhere to run and no one willing to help him fight. Wayne's revenge was more thorough than he'd imagined. Frank opened the trailer door to find 3 men in dark suits standing in the amber glow of his generator light. The one who'd spoken was tall and lean with silver hair combed straight back, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed Frank for a month. Behind him stood 2 younger men with the kind of build that suggested they weren't there for conversation. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Charles Whitfield. I represent certain interests regarding this property." The man's voice carried the polished authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "May we come in?" Frank stepped aside without speaking, his throat too constricted to form words. The 3 men filed into his trailer, somehow managing to make the cramped space feel even smaller. Whitfield settled into Frank's chair like he owned it, while his companions positioned themselves near the door. "I understand you've been making inquiries about Alamo Holdings," Whitfield said, opening his briefcase with mechanical precision, "asking questions that suggest you don't fully grasp your current situation. Who sent you?" Frank managed, his voice barely a rasp. "That's not the relevant question." Whitfield withdrew a thick manila folder and set it on Frank's desk. "The relevant question is whether you understand what happens to people who refuse to cooperate with certain arrangements." Frank stared at the folder, knowing with sickening certainty that whatever was inside would make his situation worse. Whitfield opened it and spread out a collection of photographs like a dealer laying down cards. The first photo showed Frank leaving Mickey Torino's office in 1947, both men carrying manila envelopes. The second captured him slipping money to a studio guard after hours. The third showed him in what looked like a heated argument with a young actress, whose career had mysteriously ended shortly after. "We have documentation going back 25 years, Whitfield said conversationally. Payoffs, bribes, career assassinations, cover-ups that would make front-page news if they surfaced today. The blacklist letter you sent about Marion Morrison? That was small potatoes compared to some of your other activities." Frank's legs gave out and he collapsed onto his narrow bed. The photographs swam before his eyes, evidence of sins he'd committed and buried, thinking they were dead and forgotten. But Wayne hadn't just been planning revenge against Frank's present. He'd been excavating Frank's past, unearthing every skeleton, cataloging every moment of corruption. "The Patricia Holloway incident alone would destroy what's left of your reputation," Whitfield continued, tapping one particular photo. "Talented girl, wasn't she? Until you decided she'd rejected your advances one too many times." Frank's stomach lurched. Patricia Holloway, a 22-year-old hopeful who'd caught his attention in 1951. When she'd refused his dinner invitations, Frank had spread rumors about her being difficult to work with, mentally unstable. She'd left Hollywood within 6 months, and Frank had heard she'd killed herself 2 years later, though he'd never bothered to verify the story. "She didn't kill herself," Whitfield said, reading Frank's expression with disturbing accuracy. "She moved back to Ohio, became a school teacher. But she never forgot what you did to her. When Mr. Wayne's people reached out, she was very cooperative. The trailer walls seemed to be closing in." Frank reached for his bourbon with trembling hands, but Whitfield's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't. You'll want a clear head for this next part." Whitfield produced another set of documents, legal papers with official seals and signatures. "Effective immediately, you're being evicted from this property. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Any personal belongings left behind will be considered abandoned. You can't do that, Frank whispered. I have a lease. Had a lease with Westward Entertainment, which was dissolved yesterday morning. The property has reverted to its new owners, who are exercising their right to terminate all existing agreements. Frank felt something fundamental break inside him. Not just hope, but his basic understanding of how the world worked. He'd been a powerful man once, someone who could make or break careers with a phone call. Now he was being evicted like a vagrant, his entire life reduced to 72 hours and whatever could fit in his car. Why are you telling me this? Frank asked. Why not just have me thrown out? Whitfield's smile was arctic. Because Mr. Wayne wants you to understand that this is justice, not cruelty. Every humiliation you're experiencing, every door being slammed in your face, every friend who suddenly can't take your calls, it's all deliberate, it's all earned. The men stood to leave, but Whitfield paused at the door. One more thing. We know about the safety deposit box at First National Bank, the emergency cash, the compromising photos you've been saving for insurance. Don't bother going there. The contents have been seized as evidence in an ongoing investigation. After they left, Frank sat in the sudden silence, staring at the photographs scattered across his desk. Each image was a window into the man he'd been, cruel, vindictive, drunk on power. But seeing them laid out like this, he realized something that chilled him more than Wayne's revenge. He couldn't remember feeling guilty about any of it at the time. The remorse burning through him now felt foreign, unfamiliar, like an emotion belonging to someone else. Frank's hands moved mechanically, shuffling through the scattered photographs, searching for something he couldn't name. In the stark light of the trailer, each image seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, evidence of a man he recognized but no longer understood. How had he become this person? When had cruelty become as natural to him as breathing? He picked up the photo of Patricia Holloway, studying the young woman's hopeful face frozen in black and white. She was leaving a casting office, clutching her headshots, her expression bright with the kind of optimism that Hollywood devoured like a cancer. Frank remembered the day this was taken, remembered following her, documenting her movements, building his case for destroying her simply because she'd said no to dinner. But as he stared at the image, something else surfaced from the depths of his memory, a sound, high-pitched laughter that cut through the years like a rusty blade. Look at him, Velma. Look at our little Frankie trying to be important. Frank's hand jerked, sending the photograph fluttering to the floor. That voice, his mother's voice, drunk and vicious after another failed audition. The memory hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back to a cramped apartment above a delicatessen in Chicago, 1912. He was 8 years old, watching his father practice his vaudeville routine in their living room, while his mother sat in the corner, nursing a bottle of gin and a grudge that seemed to grow larger every day. You're fooling yourself, Harold, she'd hissed. You're not an entertainer, you're a joke, and every booker in this city knows it. Frank pressed his palms against his temples, trying to stop the flood of memories, but they came anyway. His father, Harold Morrison, bent over rejection letters at the kitchen table. His father counting pennies to afford new sheet music. His father coming home night after night with stories of auditions that went nowhere, promises that dissolve like smoke. And always his mother's laughter. Cruel, cutting, designed to strip away whatever dignity Harold had left. Why don't you just give up? Save us all the embarrassment? Frank lurched to his feet, the trailer spinning around him. He understood now why the photographs felt so familiar, why each cruel act seemed choreographed by some invisible director. He wasn't looking at evidence of Frank Morrison's sins. He was looking at his mother's playbook, executed with precision that would have made her proud. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Every career he'd destroyed had been his father's career. Every hopeful actor he'd humiliated had been Harold Morrison, standing in that Chicago living room, practicing his soft shoe routine while his wife sharpened her tongue for another attack. Oh God, Frank whispered, his voice breaking. I became her. He saw it all now with crystalline clarity. The day he'd first felt real power at Republic Pictures, the intoxicating rush of watching a young actor's face crumble under his rejection. How natural it had felt to twist the knife, to add insults to injury, to watch hope die in another man's eyes. He'd told himself he was just being honest, just maintaining standards. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd been his mother, and every actor who'd walked through his office had been his father. The Patricia Holloway incident wasn't about a woman rejecting his advances. It was about seeing his father's desperate optimism in her face and needing to kill it before it reminded him of what he'd come from. Every blacklist letter, every career assassination, every calculated cruelty had been an attempt to murder the memory of Harold Morrison practicing his dance steps in a shabby apartment while his family watched with contempt. Frank stumbled to his desk drawer and pulled out a faded photograph he'd kept hidden for 30 years, his parents' wedding picture, taken in 1903. Harold looked impossibly young, his eyes bright with dreams that hadn't been crushed yet. Velma stood beside him, already showing signs of the bitterness that would consume their marriage. At the bottom, in Harold's careful handwriting, the beginning of our grand adventure. Frank had mocked his father's optimism, just as his mother had, but sitting in his trailer, surrounded by evidence of his own systematic cruelty, he finally understood what his father had been trying to achieve. Harold Morrison had believed that somewhere in the world was an audience that would appreciate his small talents, a place where dreams could survive contact with reality. Frank had spent 30 years proving his father wrong, destroying every dreamer who reminded him of Harold's foolish hope. And in doing so, he'd become the very thing that had killed his father's spirit, a person who found pleasure in crushing other people's aspirations. The trailer felt like a confessional now, heavy with the weight of recognition. Wayne's revenge wasn't just about one blacklisted actor. It was about every dream Frank had murdered in service of his own buried shame. Every time he'd laughed at an audition gone wrong, every time he'd written a letter designed to destroy a career, he'd been channeling his mother's venom, trying to prove that his father had been right to give up. But Harold Morrison had never given up. He'd died practicing. Frank placed the wedding photograph on his desk with trembling fingers, Harold's faded handwriting blurring through his tears. The silence of the trailer pressed against him like a living thing, broken only by the distant hum of the generator and the whisper of desert wind through the abandoned sets outside. He needed air, real air, not the stale atmosphere of his confession box. Frank stepped outside into the cool night, his feet carrying him without conscious direction through the maze of western facades. The moon cast everything in silver relief. The saloon fronts, the general store, the church with its crooked steeple. Props from 100 forgotten films, now serving as tombstones for dreams that had never quite taken flight. His footsteps echoed off the false fronts as he walked deeper into the ranch, past the remnants of chase scenes and shootouts, love stories and last stands. Somewhere in this manufactured wilderness, John Wayne, Marion Morrison, had probably stood as a young man, learning his craft, building the legend that would eclipse every other Western star in Hollywood history. Frank stopped at the entrance to what had once been the town square set, where a wooden platform served as a makeshift stage for outdoor scenes. In the moonlight, it looked less like a movie prop and more like the vaudeville stages his father had dreamed of conquering. Harold Morrison had never made it this far west, never saw the desert that stretched endlessly beyond the mountains. He died in that Chicago apartment, still practicing his routine, still believing that tomorrow might bring the break he'd been waiting for. "I'm sorry, Pop," Frank whispered to the empty air. The words felt strange in his mouth, rusty from disuse. When was the last time he'd apologized to anyone? When had he last allowed himself to feel genuine remorse instead of the calculated regret that came with being caught? A sound made him turn, the crunch of gravel under boots. Frank's heart hammered as a figure emerged from the shadows between two buildings, tall and familiar even in silhouette. For a moment he thought it might be Wayne himself, come to witness Frank's final humiliation. But as the man stepped into the moonlight, Frank saw it was someone else entirely. "Hello, Frank." The voice belonged to Eddie Torino, Mickey's younger brother. Frank remembered him as a runner in the old days, carrying messages between studios and handling the kind of business that couldn't be conducted over telephone lines. Eddie looked older now, gray threading his dark hair, but his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him valuable to men who dealt in secrets. Eddie Frank's voice cracked like an adolescent's. "I tried calling Mickey." "Mickey's dead." Eddie's words cut through the night air with surgical precision. "Heart attack. 3 days ago. Happened right after you called him. Frank felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Mickey Torino had been his last lifeline, the only person in Hollywood who might have been willing to help him navigate this nightmare. Now that connection was severed, leaving Frank more isolated than ever. "I'm sorry," Frank said, and meant it. "I didn't know." Mickey was scared of Wayne. "Did you know that?" Eddie stepped closer, his boots ringing against the wooden platform. Man who'd faced down studio heads and mob lawyers, and he was terrified of what John Wayne might do if crossed. Said Wayne had patience like a mountain, slow, steady, and absolutely unstoppable once he started moving. Frank swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this?" "'Cause Mickey left something for you before he died. A message." Eddie reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, thin and unmarked. "He said you'd need to understand the scope of what you were up against." Frank took the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Mickey's familiar scrawl. The handwriting was shakier than Frank remembered, betraying the fear Eddie had described. "Frank, if you're reading this, it means you finally poked the bear. Wayne's been planning this for 20 years, maybe longer. He's got documentation on everyone who ever wronged him, plus their associates, their families, their friends. You think this is about you? You're just the appetizer. He's going after the whole damn system that tried to destroy him. Get out while you can. Some fights can't be won. 20 years, Frank breathed, looking up at Eddie. He's been planning this for 20 years? Longer, probably. Mickey said Wayne never forgot a slight, never forgave an insult. He just waited until he had the power to do something about it. Eddie's expression was unreadable in the moonlight. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you know?" Frank stared at the letter, then at the false town surrounding them. Every facade, every prop, every carefully constructed illusion suddenly seemed to represent something larger, the manufactured dreams of Hollywood itself, built on the bones of broken careers and discarded hopes. "I don't know," Frank admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I honestly don't know." Eddie nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Then you better figure it out fast, because Wayne's not done with you yet." The crunch of Eddie's departing footsteps faded into the desert silence, leaving Frank alone with Mickey's final warning clutched in his trembling hands. 20 years of planning, the scope of Wayne's patience and methodical preparation crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't revenge, it was systematic demolition, executed with the precision of a master craftsman. Frank looked up at the false storefronts surrounding him, their painted facades peeling in the moonlight like diseased skin. Somewhere in this manufactured ghost town lay the answer he'd been avoiding. The confrontation he'd spent 30 years running from was finally upon him, and there was nowhere left to hide. His feet carried him toward the largest building on the set, a 2-story hotel facade that had served as the centerpiece for countless Western films. The structure groaned as he climbed the exterior stairs to the second-floor balcony, each step echoing like a countdown. From this vantage point, he could see the entire ranch spread out below him, the saloon, the jail, the church, all of it bathed in silver moonlight. It looked peaceful from here, almost beautiful. But Frank knew better now. Every board, every nail, every carefully constructed illusion was part of Wayne's trap. Magnificent view, isn't it? Frank spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. A figure stepped from the shadows at the far end of the balcony, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably familiar even after 30 years. John Wayne moved with the same easy confidence that had made him a star, but his eyes held something Frank had never seen in the movies, cold, calculating satisfaction. "Hello, Frank." Wayne's voice carried the same drawl that had charmed audiences worldwide, but stripped of warmth it sounded like gravel scraping against bone. "Been a long time." Frank's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "Marion. Nobody's called me that in years." Wayne stepped closer, and Frank could see the lines time had carved around his eyes, the gray threading his hair. Funny how names work. You give someone a name, and if it sticks, it becomes who they are. Marion Morrison. That was a weak name, wasn't it? The name of someone who'd never amount to anything. "I was wrong," Frank whispered. "Yes, you were." Wayne's smile held no humor. "But being wrong wasn't your real sin, Frank. Your real sin was enjoying it. I watched you that day in 1926 when you destroyed my audition. You weren't just rejecting an actor. You were savoring the moment. The look on your face when you told me I'd never work in this town again. That was pure pleasure. Frank remembered that day with sickening clarity. A young, awkward kid from Iowa, trying too hard to impress. Frank had seen something in Marion Morrison's desperate eagerness that had disgusted him. The same pathetic hope he'd watched his father cling to night after night. "I saw my father in you," Frank said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Every time you stumbled over your lines, every time you tried to make that costume fit, you were him." Harold Morrison, practicing his vaudeville routine in our living room while my mother laughed at him. Wayne's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Your father was an actor?" "Vaudeville. Small time, small talent, big dreams." Frank's voice cracked. "My mother destroyed him piece by piece, the way I destroyed you, the way I destroyed everyone who reminded me of what I came from." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence on the balcony, 30 years of accumulated pain and anger hanging between them like smoke. Frank could hear the wind moving through the empty buildings below, a sound like ghosts whispering secrets to the dead. "You want to know something, Frank?" Wayne's voice had lost some of its edge. "That day you blacklisted me. You did me the biggest favor of my life. I was trying to be someone else's version of a cowboy, copying what I thought Hollywood wanted. You forced me to go away and figure out who I really was." Frank looked up, startled by the unexpected note of reflection in Wayne's tone. "I spent 2 years working real ranches, learning to ride, learning to shoot, learning to move like a man who belonged in the saddle. When I came back to Hollywood, I wasn't Marion Morrison anymore. I was John Wayne, and John Wayne didn't need your approval. Then why?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "Why all this? Why destroy my life if I did you a favor?" Wayne's eyes hardened again. "Because it was never about me, Frank. It was about everyone who came after me. Every actor you crushed because it made you feel powerful. Every dream you murdered because it reminded you of your own shame." Frank felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. The last wall between who he'd been and who he'd become crumbled away, leaving him exposed and defenseless. "I became her," he said, his voice thick with tears. "I became my mother." Wayne nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." Wayne moved to the balcony railing, his hands resting on the weathered wood. "My daddy died when I was 13, he said, his voice softer now. "Lung fever took him fast. But before he went, he told me something I never forgot. Duke. He said, that's what he called me. Duke, every man carries his father's dreams and his mother's fears. The trick is knowing which one to feed." Frank joined him at the railing, keeping a careful distance. "I fed the wrong one, for 30 years. They stood in silence, 2 old men on a movie set balcony, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 manufactured stories. Frank thought of all the scripts that had played out in this artificial town tales of redemption and revenge, of heroes and villains finding their true natures in moments of crisis. But none of those stories felt as real as this one. "What happens now?" Frank asked. Wayne pulled out a manila folder from inside his jacket. "Now you decide who you want to be for whatever time you have left." Frank opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were legal documents, transfer papers, contracts, deeds, all of it returning ownership of the ranch to Frank, free and clear. No liens, no debts, no conditions. "I don't understand." "Revenge is a young man's game, Frank. I started this when I still had the fire for it. But standing here now, looking at what you've become." Wayne shook his head. "Destroying you won't bring back the careers you ruined, won't heal the damage you did. All it would do is make me more like the man you used to be." Frank stared at the papers, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "You're giving it back? I'm giving you a choice. You can sell this place, take the money, and disappear. Buy yourself a quiet retirement somewhere nobody knows the name Frank Morrison." Wayne paused. "Or you can stay. Try to build something decent on the bones of what you destroyed. Why?" Wayne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first pale hint of dawn was beginning to show. "Because 30 years ago you saw your father in me and tried to kill him. Tonight, I see my father in you, and he wouldn't want me to finish what your mother started." Frank felt tears tracking down his cheeks, hot against the cool desert air. When was the last time he'd cried? When had he last felt anything beyond the gnawing emptiness that had consumed him for so long? "I wouldn't know how," he whispered, "how to build something decent. I've forgotten how to be anything but cruel." "Then learn." Wayne's voice carried the same authority that had commanded movie screens for decades. "Find someone who still remembers how to dream and help them instead of hurting them. It won't undo what you did, but it might be a start." Wayne turned to leave, then paused. "There's one more thing in that folder. A letter from your father. Mickey Torino's boys found it in your mother's effects after she died." "She kept it from you." Frank's hands shook as he found the envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in Harold Morrison's careful script from my son Francis, when he's old enough to understand. "Read it when you're ready," Wayne said, "when you can hear his voice instead of hers." The sound of Wayne's boots on the wooden stairs echoed through the false town, growing fainter until it was swallowed by the desert wind. Frank remained on the balcony, clutching the letter from a father he'd never really known, watching the sun creep over the mountains and paint the abandoned sets in shades of gold. For the first time in 30 years, the morning felt like a beginning instead of an ending. 3 months later, Frank Morrison stood in the same spot, watching a young actress from Fresno practice her lines on the platform below. She was raw, unpolished, probably headed for heartbreak. But there was something in her face, a determined hope that reminded him of his father practicing in that Chicago apartment. This time, Frank found himself wanting to help her succeed. The letter from Harold Morrison, read and reread until he'd memorized every word, rested in his shirt pocket. It spoke of love, of faith in dreams, of the importance of lifting others up instead of tearing them down. It ended with a line that had become Frank's daily prayer. "Remember, son, we become the stories we tell ourselves. Make yours a good one." In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled the desert thermals, hunting not with cruelty but with purpose. Frank watched it soar and remembered what it felt like to hope.